Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It has been a cold few days here in Alabama. It's rare that we really just freeze over, but it's happened. And the bank has been closed for like 3 days now. Um anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed a little bit of a different speed and maybe you got to play in the ice a little bit. Not much snow to speak of, but hopefully you enjoyed a little ice. Okay, here we go. It's always different when I'm recording this way because we don't have any interaction. I can't see your faces. So here's what I want to say. In this email, where you have the video link, you also have my notes. You always see me with a piece of paper in class. You always see that I'm holding something and I'm looking at notes. You have those. You have them. So if you're watching this on a phone, stop the video and go find the notes so that you can follow along. Just go find the notes. And if you're not watching it on a video, pull it up on your computer so you can have a couple of tabs open. That way you can hear what I'm talking about and you can follow along too. Of course, if you just want to write everything down, that's all right too. Okay, so I want to start again with the passive voice and the active voice. We talked about that a little bit last week. Oh, by the way, this is your last week of stories. You have one more story assignment, and then we're going to shift gears and go into essays. We'll start with essays next time. So last story assignment, and after this, after you've written your stories and I have grades and everything from that, you'll get grades and your parents will get those grades too. So just a heads up, this is your last story assignment this week. Okay, active voice and passive voice. Remember that when we talked about active voice last week, that means that the subject of the sentence is doing something. You're using an action verb. The subject of the sentence is actually it's active. The subject is doing something in the sentence. And with the passive voice, the subject of the sentence is not doing anything, and it may be acted upon by something else. So, I think I gave you some examples there, but maybe not. I'm just going to give you some examples that I wrote down on my notes. Okay. There will be times that the passive voice is what you want to use, but if you're using the passive voice, then you need to know that the focus shifts. And I'm going to tell you what I mean, okay? Let's say I'm using active voice here, and I say Tommy Lee Jones caught the fugitive. And I don't know if y'all have seen that movie or not, but it's called The Fugitive, and Tommy Lee Jones catches the guy. So in this sentence, Tommy Lee Jones is the subject of the sentence, and he caught the fugitive, and something is being caught, something is being verb, that's the fugitive, so that's the direct object. But the subject, Tommy Lee Jones, is active. It's an action verb, caught. Right? You with me so far? The subject of the sentence is doing something. Okay, so now I'm gonna turn that around and I'm gonna make it a passive voice sentence. The fugitive was caught by Tommy Lee Jones. So there, the fugitive is the subject of the sentence, and the verb is was caught. But what is the subject doing? Nothing. He's being caught. He's being acted upon by somebody else, right? So the focus of those sentences is different, because in the first one where I said Tommy Lee Jones caught the fugitive, he is the focus of the sentence. The subject there is the focus. Tommy Lee Jones is the subject, so he's the focus of that sentence. But if you turn it around and you say the fugitive was caught by Tommy Lee Jones, then you're not focused on Tommy Lee Jones anymore, because the fugitive is the subject of that sentence. And it's just a different way to approach it. So whatever your subject is, that's leading. That's the leading idea. That's where the focus is going to be. So if you start with an active voice, it's a different focus. So even if your subject is not acting but is being acted upon, you're coming at it from a different angle, and it's going to have a different feel and a different focus. Okay, so let me give you another one. Let me give you an action, the active voice first. Okay, so last year I had y'all go through Elements of Style and the book, The Elements of Style, and I haven't done that this year, but some of the things that I'm using came from that, and some of the notes that I have will be from a book called Rules for Writers, and some of them I just took from those things, and some of them I tweaked a little bit just to give you a little variety. Okay. Active voice. The scientist heated the solution to the boiling point before it was reduced in volume. Okay. The scientist heated the solution to the boiling point before it was reduced in volume. Okay. The focus there is on the scientist. The scientist heated. It's an action verb. He's doing something, right? He, she. The scientist heated the solution. It's an action verb. The scientist is doing something, but let's turn it to a passive voice. Okay. The solution was heated to the boiling point before it was reduced in volume. So in that sentence, the solution is what we're talking about. In the active voice sentence, the scientist is the focus of the sentence. We're talking about with the scientist and what he did. And in the passive voice sentence, the solution was heated. Well, the solution is not doing anything to itself. It's being acted upon by the scientist. And so it's a passive voice, but the focus there is on the solution instead of the scientist who's doing it. Does that make sense? It's the difference between the active voice and the passive voice, and the way that they come to you. The focus is on something else. You're shifting it just slightly by the way you're presenting the information. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on from that, and if you guys have any questions, you can bring that up to me later. Okay. Well, let me just give you a couple more because I already have those. So, let's say I'm going to give you a little bit of a different kind. So, I'm going to give you an an active voice sentence. I will always remember my first summer in Alabama. I will always remember my first summer in Alabama. And so there you have will always remember. It's an action verb for an active voice sentence. If I give you the passive, my first summer in Alabama will always be remembered by me. And so in the first sentence, an active voice, you might have somebody writing about their memories and their actions, the things that they did. You're about to lead into whatever that memory was, whatever happened in the summer. You're about to lead into that. And then my first summer in Alabama will always be remembered by me. Well, it's a passive voice. So the first summer in Alabama, the first summer, that's what the subject of the sentence is. But it's not doing anything. It's still being acted upon. It's being remembered by somebody else. And so it's a different approach. It's a different feel. Your focus is shifting just slightly. Most people now do not care very much about the habits of squirrels. That's in the active voice, because do not care, well, it's an action verb. Most people now do not care. So let me give you the passive. The habits of squirrels are not much cared about by most people. So in the first sentence, you're talking about people and what they care about. And in the second sentence, you're really focusing on the habits of squirrels. The habits of squirrels are not much cared about. it's the same information, but the way you present it, you're weighting it toward one side or the other. So it makes a difference how you say it. Um, anyway, and I'm not going to give you any more of those because that's enough. And if you have any questions, we'll talk about it later. You can email me. All right. The next thing, what do I want to talk about? Okay. Put statements in positive forms instead of negative. So instead of saying, she didn't think writing essays was very much fun, she didn't think writing essays was very much fun. That's a negative way to say that. So let's put it in a positive form. She thought writing essays was boring. Okay. So instead of giving the negative, just write it in the positive form. He was not a strong person. There's the negative. Put it in the positive form. He was weak. All right. Just take the word not out of there. They did not pay attention to the instructions. They ignored the instructions. It's the same information. Just don't state it in the negative form. State it in a positive form. It gives it a little more oomph. It gives it a little more power behind it. Okay. Use concrete language instead of being vague. Use concrete language. Use concrete descriptions. Okay. So instead of saying, we have had a period of very inconvenient weather, then don't say we have had a period of inconvenient weather. You're not really telling what that is. It's really vague. Go ahead and say Alabama has been frozen solid for 3 straight days. That's very clear. There's nothing vague about it. Don't use vague language. Go ahead and use some concrete words. Okay. She showed contentment as she became comfortable in familiar surroundings. There's nothing concrete about that. You don't even know what I'm talking about. She showed contentment as she became comfortable in her familiar surroundings. It's just too vague. It doesn't give you a clear picture. You have no idea what this girl is doing or where she is. But if I say she smiled as she snuggled into her favorite chair, well, you immediately have a picture. You immediately have an idea of her exact feeling, not just she showed contentment, because that can look a lot of different ways. But she smiled, that's really concrete. There's nothing vague about that. She smiled as she snuggled into her favorite chair. So don't be vague in your descriptions. Give something that's concrete, that's easy to understand. Okay. Omit needless words. Omit needless words. Writing is often made much stronger when you can reduce it and make it concise. Don't use 10 or 12 words when 6 will do. Don't use more words than you need. If you want to say something like, the reason why is that, just say because. You've taken 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words and made it one. The reason why is that, just say because. Something is used for cooking purposes. Well, just say it's used for cooking. Just take that one word out. Sometimes you can reduce something by a whole lot, and sometimes you can reduce it just by 1 or 2 words. So if you want to say, she is a girl who, just say she. Just say she and take all the rest of that out of there. This is a story that, this story, just take the extra out. You don't need all that stuff. You don't need all the extra words. So, I have talked, I don't know if I've said it to you before in the high school class, but I know I've said it in the middle school class before. If you guys have ever seen a grape or a plum or a nectarine or a peach or something that starts to get a little shrivelly, I'm not talking about something rotten. I'm just talking about something where the skin is a little bit shrivelly. What's happening is that the water inside the fruit is evaporating. And when that happens, it leaves just the sweetness behind. It just leaves the sugars and all the water is gone. So it begins to shrink just a little bit because the water evaporates. Okay, this is what I want you to do with your writing. Let all the extra stuff evaporate. Take it out of there, and it just leaves a condensed version of what you wanted to say in the first place. It just leaves the sugar in there. Let everything else go. Let everything else evaporate. Don't use 10 words when you can use 5 or 6. Shrink it as much as you can, and then your writing becomes more powerful because you don't have extra stuff in there. Take the extra stuff out. Just condense it wherever you can. And sometimes we don't want to do that because we want to add length, or we want to make our paragraphs a little bit longer. We want to look like we've written more. But I'm not usually asking you guys for a word count. I'm not, especially with stories and sometimes with poetry when we were there, I wasn't necessarily asking you for a certain length. Sometimes in poetry we did have a certain pattern that we needed to follow, or I asked you for a certain number of lines. But in stories, I really haven't given you a certain length that I wanted. I've just said make it a complete story. And sometimes we want to add extra words, make it sound fuller or more complete. But really, all those extra words will work against you. Just take out whatever you can. Just condense it. I think somebody's at my door. Maybe not. Okay, next thing. And this is obviously going to be shorter. I say obviously, but it will be shorter because I don't have any interaction from you guys. I'm just looking at my notes and I'm giving you what I have. Okay. I think okay. Some of you guys use Grammarly, and I don't have a problem with that. That's fine if you want to use Grammarly because it it helps you get your punctuation in order, and it helps you get some word usage cleaned up. I don't want you to use Grammarly or something like that to replace your words with words that you would never use. Don't do that because then it just doesn't sound like you. It doesn't sound like you're writing. And I like to hear from you guys. I've read a lot from you guys, and I know what you should sound like. So just use words that you would normally use and learn new words as you go. Keep a thesaurus with you or open one up online and look for synonyms, look for antonyms, look for new words that you can learn. But I know what you should sound like, and so I want you to keep sounding like yourself and add some new words in as you go. Anyway, back to Grammarly. If you want to use that for grammar and punctuation and where you should put your commas and all that, that's fine. When you start to indent, Grammarly will do this a different way. Grammarly doesn't always indent at the beginning of a paragraph. Grammarly will skip lines between your paragraphs, and it's kind of the new correct way to do it. And if you want to do it that way, that's okay. If you don't use that, make sure that you're indenting at each new paragraph so that I don't look at your writing and go, oh my goodness, that one paragraph is a whole page long. Don't do that. And you're going to scare your classmates if they're reading your stuff and there's no break in your paragraphs. So indent, start new paragraphs, indent where you start a new one, or if you're using Grammarly, it'll skip a line. There's no reason to skip 3 or 4 or 5 lines. You don't have to do that. It's just one is enough, just enough to let your reader know there's a little break here and I'm starting a new paragraph. But just for the sake of clarity and just for the sake of ease of reading, give us a little spot where we can go and take a breath between one paragraph and the next. Okay, we've talked a little bit about that before. All right, moving on to the next thing. I hope you guys are taking notes. Parallelism. Parallelism is just making sure that your ideas and your phrases are kind of balanced in your writing. And I'm going to show you what I mean. We've already, all this year, really, well, most of this year, we've been talking about sentence structure and how sentences are put together and the way paragraphs are built and recognizing patterns in the way that we use our language. And this becomes important because you need to be able to recognize the patterns in your own sentences. You need to be able to recognize your own structure and make the structure match in different parts of your sentence. Okay. So this is where you can see my notes. If you have those pulled up, this is a good time. Okay, first sentence there. Children who study music also learn confidence, coordination, and they are creative. Do you see what's wrong with this one? There's a list here. There's a list. Children who study music also learn, and then you have a list of things that are learned, right? They learn confidence, coordination, and they are creative. Okay. Confidence and coordination match. Those are nouns. They learn this thing and this thing. Those two things match. They're nouns. But then you have and they are creative, which is an independent clause. It's a whole thought. It's a subject and a verb and an adjective. That can stand alone by itself. And so you've got children who study music also learn noun, noun, independent clause. So they don't match. You need to have noun, noun, noun. Children who study music also learn confidence, coordination, and creativity. So then they all go together. That is what parallelism means. You're making them all balanced. You're making them all match. Okay, the next one. Sam drove down the middle of the road, ran one red light and two stop signs. Okay, Sam drove down the middle of the road. He drove down the middle of the road. That's one verb phrase. Ran one red light. That's another verb phrase. And two stop signs. So there's no verb there. It's not a verb phrase. Okay, you got to make them match. You got to make them parallel. Sam drove down the middle of the road, ran one red light, and went through two stop signs. There's a verb in that one which makes it complete. It makes it all parallel. It makes it balanced. The clerk told me, okay, we're getting to something else here. The clerk told me either to change my flight or take the train. Okay, you have an either or here, and those need to be balanced. If you have an either, you have an or, and they work together. Okay, the clerk told me either to change my flight or to take the train. Right? You have infinitive phrases. Do you remember that an infinitive is the verb? It's to plus the verb. Okay, to run, to jump, to build, to swim, to kick, to walk, whatever it is, it's to plus the verb. That's your infinitive. So here you have to change my flight or to take the train. You have two infinitive phrases and you need to balance those out. In the first sentence, you have to change my flight or take the train. So the second one is not an infinitive. It's just the action verb. Okay. You just got to balance them. You got to make them the same. Mom could not persuade me that giving brings as much joy as to receive. What's wrong with that? The verbs, they're just in different phrases. They're just in different, what do I want to say? The construction is different. The construction is different here. So, Mom could not persuade me that giving, which is an ing verb, brings as much joy as to receive, which is the infinitive. They're not in the same form. That's what I was trying to say. They're not the same form of the verb. Mom could not persuade me that giving, the ing form of the verb, brings as much joy as receiving, which is also in the ing. This is a participle. Okay. Just put them in the same form so that they match. Okay. I don't think I need to go any further with that. I think you guys understand what I'm saying. look at the notes, read over them again. If you have some questions, just email me. Okay, next, untangling grammatical structure. All right, just follow along with me. When an employee is promoted without warning, can be alarming. When an employee is promoted without warning, first of all, that's the whole subject. When it's a clause, but it's the whole subject. When an employee is promoted out without warning, can be alarming. The way this is set up, you have the whole subject there, but it doesn't make sense as a subject. When an employee is promoted without warning, that's set up as the subject, can be alarming, and it just doesn't work that way. Okay, but you need to straighten that out. You need to figure it out. Being promoted without warning, that works. That works as the subject. Being promoted without warning can be alarming. When you put when on the front of something like that, then you have made it dependent. You've made it a dependent, depending on how you've used it here. You can have a dependent phrase or you can have a dependent clause. But when you have that at the beginning, that doesn't need to stand right there as the subject. It doesn't work. Being promoted without warning, that can be the subject. Being promoted without warning can be alarming. So that makes more sense. Okay, next one. Although the United States is one of the wealthiest nations of the world, but more than 12 million of our children live in poverty. Okay, you got two conjunctions there, all right? The first is although, and it's a subordinating conjunction. And then later on you have but, which is a coordinating conjunction. And the difference, okay, a coordinating conjunction, the ones that we think of immediately, and, or, but. We use those all the time. Those are coordinating conjunctions. And what it means is you're joining two equal parts. All right, you're joining two equal parts. But although is not coordinating conjunctions, it's a subordinating conjunction, which means that one is subordinating one part so that it becomes not the focus of the sentence. It becomes it's subordinate, right? It comes underneath the main part, all right? So, although the United States is one of the wealthiest nations of the world, and then you just take out that, you take out the but, because although the United States is one of the wealthiest nations of the world, that's a dependent clause. And so then you put a comma behind it and you go straight into the independent clause. Although the United States is one of the wealthiest nations of the world, more than 12 million of our children live in poverty. Independent clause comes at the end. So you have dependent, independent, right? That although at the front makes it a dependent clause. So that comes first, put the comma behind it, and then you put your independent clause, all right? You can change it. You can flip it around and put the although later. The United States is one of the wealthiest nations of the world, although more than 12 million of our children live in poverty. And at that point, you're using that although makes the next part the dependent clause, and because it comes second, you don't need a comma there. The United States is one of the wealthiest nations of the world, although more than 12 million of our children live in poverty. Okay, and you can play around with the way you use your conjunctions. If you put the dependent clause first, you have to put a comma behind it, and then you can go in I don't know what I just said. If you put the dependent first, you put a comma behind it, and then you put the independent. Sometimes I get tangled up with my words. I don't know what I said at first, but hopefully that's clear now. Okay, we've talked about that before. Dependent and independent clauses. And just straighten your structure out. Just make sure that it makes sense. Sometimes it will help you to read it out loud to yourself. Sometimes it will help you to ask somebody else to ask your mom and dad, ask an older sibling, ask a friend, somebody to read your work out loud to you so that you can hear the mistakes. You can hear where they stumble over words, because you know what you meant. You know what you meant to say, and so your mind will just fix it. You'll just skip right over something. If you're reading it yourself, you're going to skip right over it because you know what you meant to say. But if you have somebody else read your stuff out loud, they don't know what you meant. They don't know what you meant to say, so they're going to read it just like you wrote it. And then some of the mistakes will jump out at you. You just see it. You'll hear it then. Okay, next, you need to avoid is when, is where, the reason, is because. All right, when you construct things this way, they often don't make sense. All right, let me tell you what I mean. Diabetes is where people don't produce enough insulin or can't process sugar. Diabetes is where. Diabetes is not a place. It's not a place. You can't say diabetes is where. And people say things like that all the time. We do that in conversation. You can't always write things that you would use in conversations. You can't put things in your papers that we would say. And maybe we shouldn't say stuff like, maybe we should fix our language. Diabetes is a condition. It's a condition that causes people to produce too little insulin or affects how they process sugar. It's not a place. It's a condition. So make sure that you're not using is where or is when or the reason is because badly. Don't use your words badly. Figure out how to use them correctly. Okay, the reason I missed my appointment was because my alarm didn't go off. I missed my appointment because my alarm didn't go off. You don't need the reason was. Just take that out. This is where I'm talking, I've told you just take things out that you don't need. Take out the extra words. There's no reason to have that in there. The reason I missed my appointment was because my alarm didn't go off. This is a reason is because structure. You don't need that. I missed my appointment because my alarm didn't go off. Just take out the words that you don't need. Okay. Quotations, quotation marks, and punctuation. Some of this stuff I'm going to let you read. We've talked about this in class already. A dialogue tag is he said, she said, they answered, I replied. That's a dialogue tag. It can come before the quote or it can come after. If the dialogue tag comes first, John said, I need to get my shoes before I leave. That's I need to get my shoes before I leave. That's in the quotation marks. John said, comma. John said, comma, and then you have your quotation. And because the dialogue tag comes first, the quotation is the end of the sentence. So the period goes inside the quotation marks. Okay? Dialogue tag, comma, quotation. Your period goes inside the quotation. Okay? Sometimes the dialogue tag comes at the end. So you have, I need to grab my shoes. There's your quotation. But that's not the end of the sentence. So you have a comma. I need to get my shoes, comma, but the comma goes inside the quotation marks. Said John. John said, whatever. But that's the end of the sentence after the dialogue tag. So the period comes there. All right. Commas and periods will go inside. Yeah. Commas and periods will go inside the quotation. All right. Unless the dialogue tag comes first. And then it's the period is going to end the sentence inside the quotation marks. All right. A question mark or a dash or an exclamation mark is written inside the quotation marks. Especially when it is part of the quoted material. All right. Otherwise, it goes on the outside. So, just if you're following along, I'm just giving you my notes here. How about some supper? Asked the new farmhand. So the question is, how about some supper? And that's the quotation. That's actually what he said. He's asking a question. He's asking about supper. So the question mark goes inside the quotation because that's the quote and it is a question, but it's not the end of the sentence. It's not the end of the sentence. Ask the new farmhand ends the sentence. That's the dialogue tag at the end. So So the whole thing, how about some supper? Asked the new farmhand. That's one sentence, but the whole thing is not a question. The whole thing is a statement because it's ending with asked the farmhand. It's making a statement, but inside that, inside the quotation marks, that actually is a question. So you put a question mark inside that, but that's not the end of the sentence. The end of the sentence comes with asked the farmhand, and so that's where the period is. The next one, what is the meaning of the expression, it takes one to know one? The whole thing is a question. The whole thing is a question, so there's a question mark at the end of this. But inside the quotation marks, it takes one to know one, that's not a question. So the question mark doesn't go inside there because that part is not a question. What is the meaning of the expression, it takes one to know one? The whole thing is a question mark, so you have your quotation inside the sentence, but that what's inside the quotation marks is not a question, so you don't put the punctuation in there, but the whole sentence is a question mark, so it goes out, it goes at the end, it goes outside the quotation marks. I hope that y'all are following along and you're seeing what I'm talking about. All right, we can talk more about that later. You might already understand it, you might get it and it's a breeze. That would be great, but if you don't, it's normal. You're just a normal writer. Okay. Dialogue. Dialogue can be difficult. It can be difficult because we're trying to figure out how you take a conversation and make it sound real and put it on the page. And I don't know if you guys have ever thought about this, but when you're listening to real conversations and you're listening to people talk, they don't really listen to each other. They don't listen to each other. They talk over each other. Sometimes they're quiet just long enough to jump in on top of what somebody else has said because they've been sitting there waiting to just spring out with something that they've been thinking inside their own heads the whole time somebody else was talking. They weren't listening to them. They were just waiting for a slight break so they could jump in and say something that they wanted to say. People talk over each other, they ignore one another, they ramble on about things that really don't matter at all. So if you're going to write dialogue, you have to figure out how to say things that would come out in a conversation between real people, things that they would actually say, but you can't write the full conversation the way people talk because you're going to be rambling on and it's going to be boring and your readers are not going to put up with that. So earlier in the year, I asked you guys to go somewhere and sit and just notice what's going on around you. Just listen, just watch, describe what you see, describe what you hear, describe what it smells like and what it sounds like and all that. That was something that I asked you to do earlier this year. And I kind of want to ask you to do something like that with conversation. Go to a public place. Go to a public place and listen to how the conversations work. And these need to be people that you don't know. Don't go and sit around people that you do know and listen in on their conversations because that's creepy. And you don't need to be involved in somebody else's business, and when you know somebody or you know the situation, that's more likely, and you don't need to do that. Go to a public place where you have no idea really who these people are. You don't know what they're talking about, but just listen to the way the conversation works. Go to a coffee shop or go to a bookstore or go to a restaurant, wherever there are people where you can actually sit close enough or stand close enough to hear how their conversation works. And at this point, I'm not asking you to be nosy. I'm not trying to get you to be a busybody and listening in on gossip and, filling your heart with all of these morsels of and these tidbits of information. That's not important. It doesn't actually matter what they're talking about. What you're looking for is the patterns of speech. You're looking for the way this person or this person is really pulling the conversation one way or another because somebody is driving this conversation. Somebody is driving the conversation and somebody is really not being able to pull it back their way. Just listen to the way people talk. If I asked you to do a report on bats, you know, then you would go do some research on bats. You would go watch their interactions. You would go explore how they live and how they eat and how they sleep and um, how they have interaction with other bats in their caves or whatever, wherever they are. Um, and so I'm asking you to research people. Go and find them in their caves. Go and see, how they interact with the other people and listen to the conversations. And if you think that it's going to be a little bit creepy and that people will notice you listening or something, um, take a take some headphones or something. Take some earbuds and don't have anything playing in them, but you don't want somebody to be creeped out by your research. You don't want somebody to be creeped out. But at the same time, you don't care what they're talking about. It doesn't really matter. That doesn't matter what they're talking about. You're just supposed to be learning how they interact. You're supposed to be following just the flow of the conversation. So go and notice. I don't care where you go. Just go listen to people that you do not know. These need to be strangers. Listen to the way that they interact with each other, and that will help you in your writing of dialogue because this is not an easy thing. It's not easy to figure out how to write dialogue. Okay, but as you're starting with dialogue, when you change speakers, you have to give them a new paragraph. Okay, you have to drop down. And even if it's only one line, if one speaker has just one line and you have to drop down for the next speaker, then you do it because that signals to your readers that the speaker has changed. Okay, and you don't, every time the speaker changes, you don't have to say he said and she said to make it clear who's talking. Once you establish who's doing the talking, you're just, and the only reason to say he said and she said is to let your reader know who's doing that talking. And once you establish that, you don't have to say it every time. And you really can wear your audience out if you're constantly saying he said and she said and he answered and she replied, and that'll wear your readers out. So once you establish who's taking part in this conversation and you start separating the lines and changing paragraphs when the speaker changes, then your reader can follow along and you don't have to say, okay, I'm changing speakers here, because once you drop down to the next paragraph, then the reader understands that you've changed. The reader understands that. And instead of saying he said, she said all the time, you can start using physical gestures and physical movements. So she said, it's time to go outside. And so then you may have another person, she said this, but then she rubbed her hands together, or she stretched, or she reached down to tie her shoes. And you can have those things in place of she said. So it's time to go outside. She reached down to tie her shoes. You can have the physical gestures, the physical movements going on, and that still lets you know who's doing the talking. But instead of just asking your readers to follow along with the conversation, if you're giving movements, if you're giving physical motion, then it's also a picture that your reader can follow along in the story, because the motion moves the story along. The physical gestures move the story along, and you're keeping your reader's imagination engaged, because they have to they have to imagine those movements as well. So it's not just that there's, everybody sitting at the table and it's he said and she said and all of this, because there is a conversation there and your reader does have to keep up with the conversation. But if you're having some movement, then you're also engaging the imagination in another way, because your reader has to picture what's going on with that movement. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Okay. So, point of view, we've talked about whether you're talking about third person or first person. And remember that the first person is part of the story. The first person character is I and me and we and our and mine, and um, the person telling the story is in the story. That's Huckleberry Finn. If y'all have never read that, it's Huckleberry Finn telling the stories. So it's almost like he's had these journal entries somewhere, and he's going back and he's flipping through his memories and telling you all of this to happen. So it's I and me and we and this first person. Um, Third person is somebody who's not in the story, but they're narrating. So it's he and she and they and it and them. That's third person. Um, One thing that you can do with third person is if you're a third person narrator, you can be in the minds of all the characters. Well, you should just do one at a time. But if you're talking about John over here in this part of the story, you can tell the audience John's motives. You can tell what he meant. You can tell what he was thinking. You can tell what he smelled or what he tasted without him saying it out loud, because you're the narrator and you know everything. You can see what's in his thoughts and what he feels. And then at some point you can switch and you have um, Susie in a different part of the story, and the narrator also understands what she thinks and what she feels and knows her motives and can tell things that are only going on in her mind, that are not out loud and in front of everybody. Because a third person gives the narrator the chance to know, just be omniscient, to know everything. But if you're writing in first person and it's the narrator is actually one of the characters, I and me and my, well, the first person narrator cannot be in everybody else's mind. The first person narrator can only know their own thoughts. They might be able to guess at what somebody else thought or what somebody else felt, but you can't be in everybody else's thoughts the way an all-knowing third-person narrator can. So it's just a different style. It's just a different swing at it, you know. Um, and either way is okay. Just be consistent in whichever one you choose. All right. Um, your assignment this time is a short story, but do not use emotion words. And we did this last year. You whatever emotion you choose for the story, it might be anger, it might be sadness, it might be loneliness, it might be joy. Whatever emotion that you choose, it needs to be a part of the story. You cannot give any cues so don't use emotion words. Don't use laugh or tears or cry or, you know, anger, or don't use the emotion words that tells your reader what they're supposed to feel. Um, anything that you're anything that the audience is supposed to feel should already be part of the story. No cues. Don't give any cues about what emotion you want the reader to feel. It should be a part of the story already. Okay, and this is a challenge. This is a challenge, but this is your last story assignment. So I want to see what you come up with here. Okay, and you can, of course, you can email me with any questions that you have. And okay, the reading assignment this time, I'm going to send it to you. This is some of you have told me before that you enjoy nonfiction a little bit more than you enjoy fiction. So I've mixed it up a little bit this year, and this is a nonfiction account. This is a nonfiction story. So I want you to engage with the story, read through it, and give me your thoughts about it, because this guy is telling, um, he's giving you a scene from his childhood. He's telling you a little bit about this. And this is probably, I'm pretty sure this is the longest reading assignment that I'm going to give you this year, which is, it's not terrible, y'all. It's 26 pages. So if you're not somebody who wants to sit down and read 26 pages at once, then just know ahead of time and break it up a little bit. Just you, and it's not that big a deal. It's just 26 pages. You guys can handle it. But if you don't want to do it all at once, just it's on your assignment sheet. Print all this stuff out. You have it ready. Break it up into pieces to make it more manageable. Some of you have email addresses that will not allow me to send a big file to you, so I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out and make sure that you get that, you iCloud people. Um, anyway, I think that that's all that I have, and I'm going to send this out to you shortly. So, I'll see you again next week. I hope you all enjoy.